Laugh a while you can, monkey boy.
Hi, and welcome to Hollywood Storyboards. I'm Mark Moretti. I began my career in the entertainment business as a comic book writer, artist, and editor in New York City in the 1990s before segueing into the film industry in the early 2000s. I spent 25 years in Hollywood and worked on over 50 movies and dozens of TV shows, commercials, and music videos. For years, friends and colleagues told me I should have a YouTube channel. It could be because I've had an unusual career and more unusual career path, but it's probably because I'm overly opinionated and can recite an endless stream of anecdotal film and entertainment-related information faster than crap through a goose. And judging by the reaction of people who visit our booth at Comic-Con each year, I might even be entertaining on some level. Hey, could somebody find the crowd shots, please?
And you'll be good all day.
Okay, that's a little better. Anyway, there are plenty of talking heads pontificating about movies out there. Some cover similar ground. The difference between me and them is I actually worked on movies, a lot of movies, at every stage. Development, pre-production, production, post-production, reshoots. Movies that you've probably seen. My opinions are based on my personal experience with writers, producers, directors, and scripts that I worked from. I was the lead storyboard artist for Alex Proyas' I, Robot, and this is the prologue to my commentary track of the film. I spent over a year storyboarding much of the production. The work took me from Burbank, California, to Sydney, Australia, twice, and finally, Vancouver, British Columbia, where I, Robot was filmed. Before we start the movie, I want to give you a little background on how I got involved and how a movie like I, Robot was made. In June of 2002, I received a call from Ed Natividad, one of the top illustrators in the film industry. Ed studied automotive and advanced concept design before migrating to the movie business. He's equally adept at drawing dynamic storyboards as he is at creating concept art for everything from costumes to architecture to vehicles and props. Star Wars to Dune, Transformers to DC to Marvel, he's done them all. Ed was working at Lucasfilm when we met in Hawaii a few years earlier. He'd just finished work on Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, at Skywalker Ranch. I was working on Final Fantasy in Honolulu with some of his friends. Living and working in Hawaii for a year is a great story for another day. Ed came to visit my coworkers, and I guess we hit it off. We both have families now, and our lives have gone in different directions, but 25 years later, and we're still friends. With me, that's a stretch. I went back to LA after my adventure in Hawaii. Final Fantasy was produced by a Japanese company. I know, why is the Square Pictures logo a rectangle? So I still couldn't work on Hollywood studio productions like my new friends. I went back to working on commercials, music videos, and a variety of shows at Sony's TV animation division, Adelaide Productions in Culver City. They closed their doors years ago, but at least the look of the place has improved a lot since I worked there. Ed stayed in touch while working at Skywalker Ranch on Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, for another 3 years. On weekends, he drove back to an apartment he kept at Venice Beach. He even offered to let me stay there overnight a couple of times when I was working at Sony. Culver City is on the opposite side of LA from Burbank, and it was exhausting just driving to and from work every day. Rush hour in Los Angeles is really rush hours, and surface streets were often faster than highways. And that was over 20 years ago. Ed left Lucasfilm after finishing Episode 2 and began working on studio films like Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines. Then one day he called me from the offices of production designer Patrick Tatopoulos near the Burbank airport. iRobot didn't have a green light or finished script. Ed was designing the robots and drawing storyboards, but more were needed to push the production forward. I was available. It was also non-union, so I could work on it. Let me explain. Hollywood is a union town. Studio films are unionized. You can't work on a studio film unless you're in the union, and you can't get in the union unless you worked on a union project. Yes, it's the old catch-22. So how do you get into a union? That's a longer, more complicated question that I'll cover in a later video. The most common way for an artist like me was to get onto a film before the studio commits money to the production. You have to work 30 days consecutively, that is, 6 5-day weeks, and you were then grandfathered into the union when the studio greenlit the production. In addition to illustrators, storyboard and concept artists, the Art Directors Guild, or ADG, includes production designers, art directors, model makers, set designers, and scenic artists, as well as the title and graphic artists. iRobot did not promise to be the picture that got me into the union, however. It would be made in Alex's native Australia, and it would be non-union. But it was work and would pay the bills. With a wife and 2-year-old daughter at home, that was the most important thing. Alex Proyas was better known as a director of genre pictures, notably The Crow and Dark City. The exchange rate was also a factor. 60 million in US dollars might be worth 90 million Australian back then. Patrick Tatopoulos was known as a creature guy among production designers. He created the aliens in Independence Day, the creatures in Pitch Black, Roland Emmerich's Godzilla, and a variety of monsters in other movies. He also got the blame for Battlefield Earth. I'll get back to that. The first thing I saw when I entered Patrick's shop was a stunt actor getting strapped into a werewolf costume that Patrick's team fabricated for the Kate Beckinsale film Underworld. The performer was on stilts, designed like animal haunches. A camera in the nose fed a tiny monitor in the neck piece that covered the performer's face. Suited up, he stood about 7 feet tall. It looked amazing. Ironically, in a completely unrelated turn of events, a few years later, I storyboarded the sequel, Underworld Evolution. Another story for another video. When Ed called, I was actually finishing work on a direct-to-video sequel to Bring It On called What Else? Bring It On Again. I storyboarded iRobot in Patrick's office during the day and Bring It On Again at home at night. That was a rough job. Drawing dozens of cheerleaders doing different formations from multiple angles was difficult at best. I suffered from a serious lack of sleep. Spectacular concept paintings by artist Stéphane Martiner, who I had met briefly in Vancouver a few years earlier on an ill-fated IMAX 3D production of Gulliver's Travels, lined the office walls and showed the potential of iRobot. After a couple of weeks, Alex arrived from Australia. I was a huge fan of Dark City and looked forward to working with him. I was also exhausted after weeks of working on 2 movies at once. My chest felt like someone was standing on it. I asked Ed to call an ambulance if I suddenly keeled over. Alex looked at our work and said he wanted us to join him at his office in Sydney. My last international trip was going to England and Japan to research Ninjak, a comic book character I co-created in 1994. He's the bastard son of the British royal family and his name is Colin King. Get it? He becomes a ninja spy for MI6 and the world's greatest master of bladed weapons. I researched and created the character and story, while up-and-coming artist Joe Quesada designed his costume and drew the first 3 issues. Not exactly Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Well, definitely not Stan Lee. My passport had expired, so 20th Century Fox, the studio that financed iRobot, paid to expedite a new one. A couple of days later, a limo picked me up at our Burbank apartment, and I was off for Sydney, leaving my wife Laura and daughter Celia behind. Fox flew Patrick and I to Australia in business class. Seats that flattened into beds made the 16-hour United Airlines flight a lot more comfortable. We arrived in July. Ed joined us a couple of days later. Sydney was similar to Southern California in many ways, including the temperatures, but they were reversed. I went from summer in LA to winter down under, from 90 to 100 degree temperatures to 40 to 60 degrees with more than occasional rain. Ed and I were put up at the Medina, now Adina, Hotel at 359 Crown Street in the Surrey Hills section of Sydney. Every day we walked to work and back, around a half mile up to Oxford Street in the Darlinghurst area of Sydney, then another mile to Alex's office just off Oxford. Darlinghurst is one of Sydney's main LGBTQ neighborhoods, and Oxford Street was lined with clubs, bars, and cafes run by and for Sydney's gay community. That took on a larger significance during my second trip to Australia. Alex's production company was Mystery Clock Cinema. It filled a building from the 1920s called the Old Dunbar Hotel at 27 Rennie Street, Paddington, New South Wales, 2021. A gargoyle prop from Alex's second feature, The Crow, nested on an outdoor balcony. The script we'd been working from was constantly in flux as the story was being streamlined. Scenes and characters came and went or were changed. Sometimes it wasn't even in script format. We were given descriptions and locations and asked to create action sequences within them. As I often tell people, no one hires us to draw 2 people in a room talking. Actions speak louder than words, to borrow a phrase. We create drawings that show action to get the studios excited about making the film. Even seemingly simple shots can be made dynamic by great camera placement and motion, fast or slow. Changing the focus or perspective can make an otherwise mundane image come alive. That's our job, and if we do it well, we see the shots we designed in the film, sometimes shot for shot, sometimes even frame for frame. The workload was going to be daunting, so a local Australian storyboard artist named Matt Hatton was brought on to help Ed and I get through it. We spread ourselves out on desks in a large open area on the ground floor where a bar and tables once stood and got to work. A staircase behind the back wall led up to the second floor. At the top of the stairs was a hotel counter with an old-style bank teller window where guests once checked into the hotel's upper floor rooms. Alex's assistant, Sally Madgwick, coordinated Alex's schedule and our meetings from her desk there. Alex and his producing partner, an American named Topher Dow, also had offices on the second floor. The building was so old that I could see and hear Alex through the spaces between the thick floorboards above me when he was on the phone or talking to people in his office. A room on the third floor held an Avid or non-linear editing system. One day, Alex called us up there to look at a sizzle reel an editor was cutting together. A sizzle reel is another tool to get the studio excited about making the film. It's basically a fake trailer that shows the genre and tone you intend to create, establishing the look and mood by cutting together scenes from other movies with similar subject matter, in this case, robots, detectives, action, etc. There was nothing like C-3PO, R2-D2, or Forbidden Planet's Robbie the Robot in the trailer. I do remember shots of the killer robot from Saturn III and the detective played by William Hurt in Alex's Dark City. It was quite entertaining. I wish I had a copy of it. But there was one shot they couldn't find. Alex was looking for a shot of a futuristic city, but without flying cars, jetpacks, or over-the-top Jetsons technology like The Fifth Element. One of my first jobs on a movie was drawing keyframe illustrations that capture the feel of a scene in one image. In this case, keyframes for visual effects shots for a film depicting the Los Angeles area in 1937 called The 13th Floor. That's an interesting story in itself. Before the internet, websites, and email, one way storyboard artists were hired was through samples of their work, which were presented in a book, an album featuring selections of their previous work, usually containing a variety of subjects: people, animals, buildings, cars, etc. In this case, I was working through a storyboard agency called Famous Frames, who submitted my book to the production. At the end of the meeting after I was hired, I asked the visual effects supervisor why I was chosen. I was new to the business and no one knew me. He opened my book, pointed to a drawing and said, "Because you can draw that." He was pointing at an illustration of a car I had drawn for a storyboard class, the only class I've ever taken since high school. The teacher, union artist Luis Russo, had us draw a story about a man who goes back in time to kill Hitler before he invaded Poland. The story and the car in the 13th floor were both set in 1937. My drawing of the car got me hired. The last scene in the 13th floor was exactly what Alex was looking for. The editor pulled the necessary shots from a DVD and added it to the reel. Just like getting that job, being there when Alex was looking for that particular shot was pure luck, for both of us. But as I've told my kids over the years, luck happens when preparation meets opportunity. By the way, The 13th Floor is a pretty good movie and worth watching if you haven't seen it. Having knowledge like this was one of the things I became known for. I loved movies since my father sat me down to watch King Kong as a toddler and had an encyclopedic memory for shots and scenes. I also showed Alex the teaser trailer from Terminator 2 on my laptop. The T2 teaser was over 10 years old, but no one there had seen or remembered it. It contained a series of shots showing Schwarzenegger's T-800 endoskeleton being assembled and getting skin. It had nothing to do with the look of iRobot and was unusable other than as a point of reference. Sometimes that's important. You don't want to repeat, even accidentally, something that's been seen before. When I briefly wrote the comic book version of the TV series Babylon 5, I scripted a character using an ability that I thought was appropriate. Babylon 5 creator Joe Straczynski sent me a note that basically said, "This isn't Star Trek." He was right. Problem was, I didn't watch Star Trek. By the way, I think Joe should have written the Star Wars sequels. He's a better writer than most, and I think could have made episodes 7, 8, and 9 great. One day, producer Steve McLaughlin arrived in Sydney. He was a budget-conscious guy known for getting troubled productions to the finish line. He took us all out after work, and I remember having a little too much to drink and going off on a tangent about directors. Typical. Sydney was a fantastic city. It's one of my favorite places, and I've lived or worked or traveled to London, Tokyo, Vancouver, Honolulu, Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, New York, and every major city from Maine to Key West, Florida. Like New York, Sydney is very walkable, but much smaller and more personal. There was also a downtown monorail. Technically, it was a people mover, but it seemed more like a tourist attraction. It was a loop that only went in one direction. You would have to circle the entire downtown area if you just wanted to go a stop or two in the opposite direction. Not many cities have a monorail. It was the kind of thing that could be incorporated into the film since it had a futuristic feel, at least for its day. With a little window dressing, literally, it could look like part of Chicago in 2035 when the film is set. I drew a big action sequence where Detective Spooner chases a robot on a train and through a station that could be easily adapted to one of the locations. A second version started on the platform and set the tone for the type of action and technology, in the form of a maglev elevated train, that permeated the story. We were loosely drawing Nicolas Cage as Detective Spooner, the story's protagonist and Alex's alleged choice for the lead. At one point, I compared a picture of Cage from a magazine that had a curious resemblance to Sonny, the main robot in the story. I thought it added an interesting psychological layer to the story of a man who hates robots and fit the tone of the script. I also thought it was humorous on some level. I was making a lot of it up as I went along, but my process was always based on verisimilitude, at least as far as I remember how Richard Donner applied verisimilitude to his great film Superman in 1978, a world that was grounded and believable unto itself. That's something that would take a comical turn, as far as I was concerned, about a year later. It's funny to look at the end results of the film against what I was drawing at the time. A lot of what appears in my early storyboards made its way into the final script, from Sonny's leap and concrete crunching landing, to his blood-like loss of fluid due to Spooner's gunshots, to Spooner's self-defense with his artificial arm. For the scene where Spooner corners the robot in an alley, I thought about how a robot might actually fight and came up with choreography that Alex liked. Frankly, it was a relief. This was my first real work on a film, and it allowed me to use everything I'd learned and experienced after decades of watching movies and TV shows and reading, writing, and drawing comic books. My sense of visual storytelling and practical physics was working as well as it could. This is going to sound unrelated, but isn't, so please bear with me. One weekend, I flew up to Brisbane, about an hour from the Gold Coast. An entire branch of my family lives there. I'd met several of them when they visited the U.S. Angelo Vasta, the patriarch of the family, had been a Supreme Court justice. I met Angelo's son Sal and Sal's wife Deb in New York when they passed back and forth several times on their year-long around-the-world honeymoon. I need to trademark that idea before someone makes it into a reality show. We had a great time sightseeing around the city. Sal was a big comic book fan. I took him to meet my boss at Valiant, the legendary Jim Shooter, while Laura got us into Marvel, where Sal met the great artist John Romita. There were 3 more brothers, Andrew, Damien, and Ross, and 2 sisters, Roseanne and Pauline. Some of them had kids too. We spent a day at their condo on the Gold Coast. It was beautiful, like being at Miami Beach in the winter. Patrick didn't stay in Sydney for long. Without a green light, there wasn't much he could do there that he couldn't do back in Burbank. He still had work on the Underworld film, and inquiries from other genre films were coming in. I'll get back to that. The work is mostly a blur. I was often drawing the same things over and over as sets and technology were redesigned. Sometimes I'd have to start over before I was finished. I see the storyboards now and don't remember drawing them. At some point, I remember Alex said we should stop drawing anything that resembled Nicolas Cage. I assumed that meant he was no longer in the running for the part, if he ever was. That was a casting lesson I'd carry forward. Cage had won the Oscar for Leaving Las Vegas in 1995 and followed that up with 3 big action hits, The Rock, Con Air, and Face Off. But his career after that was spiraling out of favor with the studios. Multiple writers often work on a script, each specializing in different areas. The current writer handled dialogue and relationships. Our descriptions of the action written below each panel started showing up in script revisions. For someone new to the movie industry, it was mind-boggling. The takeaway was that ideas for things I drew that were not in the script could end up in the movie. That would become a mainstay of my career. I bought a laptop in New York in the mid-1990s, mostly to write comic books. By 2002, there was a limited amount of images on the internet that could be searched for reference, but no one I knew used computers or drawing programs like Photoshop for storyboard work. Storyboard artists were still drawing the old-fashioned way. First, I would rough out the drawings in blue pencil on paper, then polish them with pencil or ink, and if there was time, use markers for embellishment. A hand turning a doorknob was easy. Unless you were in a groove, more complicated drawings often required a second pass to tighten the illustrations up. Regardless, it almost always took longer than expected. Directional arrows indicate movement. I have a rule that lets everyone know what each arrow represents, even if it is not labeled. Arrows that occur within the panel indicate something in the shot that is moving, a person, a car, a dog, etc. Arrows that penetrate or cover the panel border indicate camera movement. I knew a little bit about writing and could break a script down. For now, I was good at staging scenes and choosing camera angles. I could tell from Alex's reactions that I was doing a good job. I was also pretty fast if I drew loosely. Matt was a bit younger than me and less experienced storytelling-wise. To save time, in addition to my own workload, I used a blue pencil to lay out dozens of additional storyboards. Matt could then finish them quickly in pencil or ink. The blue all but disappeared when photocopied. After directors review storyboards, they often make changes. Panels are usually cut or added or both. Sometimes whole scenes are cut without replacement if it wasn't necessary or too expensive to film. That happened a lot. We'd almost always find ourselves cutting and pasting panels in a new order, then photocopying them into continuous sequences. It was laborious. Changes also meant renumbering every subsequent panel, sometimes altering descriptions too. The sequential numbering was very specific. Panels with single numbers, say 54, 55, and 56, were individual shots. If a shot carried over multiple panels, and that could be many, the first panel would be 26A, followed by 26B, 26C, and so forth. This ensured that everyone in every department of the production, from producers to production assistants, was prepared for each day's shoot and knew how the story would play out visually. Every page then had to be re-photocopied before getting approval. Sooner or later, every storyboard artist I knew ended up at Kinko's in the middle of the night making photocopies to meet a deadline. Ed and I did that in Sydney, too. At age 44, I was on my first real movie job. I guess I felt a little like Robert Redford in The Natural. After a decade and a half of dreaming about Hollywood while working in a series of dead-end jobs, I finally made it to the major leagues. Except for an apprenticeship in comic books, I did it with no experience, training, film, or art school. I'll hit that piñata in part 2. The work suddenly ended in September. Fox was not ready to move forward with iRobot. We flew back to Los Angeles and went back to our old lives. That meant looking for work. That's it for now. Part 2 is coming soon, and a lot faster than it took me to get a handle on Part 1, as well as shorts about my issues with Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, repurposing shots from one movie to another, and everybody's favorite punching bag, Kathy Kennedy. If you thought this little peek under the hood of movie making was fun, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons on your way out. Thanks!